Today, we're ranking of the most important World War II dive-bombing aircraft, from the machines that failed their intended purpose to the aircraft that turned dive bombing into one of the most destructive weapons of the war. Starting with number 1, Brewster SB-2A Buccaneer, United States. The Brewster SB-2A Buccaneer is almost impossible to defend at the bottom of a ranking like this because its biggest problem was not one isolated weakness. The aircraft suffered from a combination of weight, inadequate performance, poor maneuverability, and reliability problems that prevented it from fulfilling the role for which it had been ordered. The U.S. Navy wanted a modern scout bomber capable of carrying a substantial bomb load. Brewster's design was selected in 1939, but the prototype did not fly until June 1941. By then, Britain had already ordered hundreds of aircraft, and the Netherlands had also placed an order. The problem was that production commitments arrived before the aircraft had demonstrated that it was ready. The Navy's own National Naval Aviation Museum describes the SB-2A as overweight, underpowered, and lacking maneuverability. It also suffered stress problems and was considered unreliable even as a trainer. British aircraft were never used in combat and were instead diverted to training, target towing, maintenance training, or scrapped. None saw combat during the war. The numbers tell the story better than any dramatic description. The aircraft had a 1,700 horsepower Wright R-2600 engine and could carry a 1,000-pound internal bomb load, but its performance could not compensate for its structural and handling problems. That is why the Buccaneer belongs at number 20. It was not simply outclassed in combat, it largely failed to reach combat at all. The Buccaneer was built to dive into battle. Instead, history diverted it away from the battlefield. Number 2. Curtiss SBC Helldiver, United States. The Curtiss SBC Helldiver represents a different kind of failure. It was not a useless aircraft when it was designed. The problem was that aviation technology was moving faster than the aircraft itself. The SBC was a two-seat carrier scout bomber built around the late 1930s American concept of combining reconnaissance with dive bombing. At the time, the idea made sense. A naval aircraft needed to find the enemy, attack him, and defend itself. But the arrival of faster monoplanes quickly exposed the limitations of older biplane thinking. The SBC was already approaching obsolescence when newer American dive bombers appeared. Its fixed or semi-fixed design philosophy belonged to an earlier generation, while aircraft such as the SBD Dauntless offered a more modern stress-skin monoplane structure and much stronger overall performance. The U.S. Navy's wartime documentation lists the SBC alongside its other scout bomber types, but was increasingly a second-line machine once the war began. That distinction matters. The SBC was not a spectacular engineering disaster like the Buccaneer. It simply arrived at the wrong moment. The Navy had moved toward faster, more capable monoplanes, and the SBC could no longer compete. Its ranking is therefore based on battlefield relevance rather than the claim that every aspect of the design was poor. It was a competent aircraft from an earlier era that had little future once modern carrier aviation matured. The Helldiver was not destroyed by one fatal flaw. It was overtaken by aviation itself. Number 3. Aichi D-1A Japan. The Aichi D-1A was once a modern answer to a modern problem. By the beginning of the Pacific War, however, it had become a relic. The Imperial Japanese Navy needed a carrier-based dive bomber during the 1930s, and Aichi's D-1A emerged from German Heinkel design influence. It was a two-seat biplane with fixed landing gear and fabric-covered construction. The aircraft became an important Japanese dive bomber during the Second Sino-Japanese War. But the same features that made sense during its development became liabilities as the war approached. Biplane construction and fixed landing gear imposed aerodynamic penalties, while the aircraft's overall performance was increasingly inferior to newer monoplanes. Approximately 590 D-1s were produced, but by the time Japan entered the Pacific War, surviving examples had largely been removed from frontline service and were being used mainly as trainers. That is important for the ranking. The D-1A was not a failed aircraft in its original historical context. It served effectively in an earlier conflict. But this ranking asks how these machines ultimately performed as World War II dive bombers. Against the faster, stronger aircraft that followed, the D-1A had no realistic path back to first-line service. So number 18 is not a punishment for being old. It reflects the brutal speed of technological change. The D-1A helped establish Japan's dive bombing tradition, but by 1941, that tradition had already moved on. Number 4. Vought SB-2U Vindicator, United States. The Vought SB-2U Vindicator entered service during an important transition in American naval aviation. The U.S. Navy wanted a monoplane scout bomber, and the Vindicator represented a major step away from the older biplanes. It entered fleet service in December 1937, and the Navy considered it an important technological advance. Its speed was substantially greater than that of the biplane scout bombers it replaced. The problem was that the Vindicator itself was already being overtaken. Its construction represented the last development of an older truss fuselage and fabric covering approach. The newer SBD Dauntless adopted stressed skin metal construction and offered a much more modern foundation for dive bombing. The Navy's own museum description identifies this structural transition as one reason the Vindicator was replaced. The aircraft did see combat, including operations with Marine Corps units during the early Pacific War, so calling it a complete failure would be unfair. But its combat usefulness was limited by its aging design and the rapid arrival of better aircraft. This puts the Vindicator above the aircraft that essentially failed to reach combat, but below machines that could remain effective under wartime conditions. The important lesson is that the Vindicator was not badly designed for 1937. It simply could not remain competitive once the war demanded higher performance and greater survivability. The Vindicator was a step forward, but war demanded another leap. Number 5. Warneuport LN-401, France. The Warneuport LN-401 was built for one of the most specialized missions in naval aviation, attacking ships with precision from a steep dive. France developed the aircraft as a carrier-capable dive bomber with folding wings and naval equipment for operations from French carriers. The design was compact and purpose-built, but its career collided with one of the worst possible circumstances, the German invasion of France in 1940. The aircraft entered combat during the campaign in northern France. According to surviving historical records, virtually all available LN-401 and LN-411 dive bombers were committed to attacks against advancing German forces between May 10 and June 4, 1940. The surviving aircraft were subsequently moved south and eventually transferred to North Africa. The problem was not simply the aircraft's design. It was the strategic environment in which it had to fight. France entered the war with a small and fragmented force of dive bombers, and the LN-401 could not overcome the enormous operational problems created by the rapid German advance. Its numbers were tiny compared with the scale of the campaign, and the type never had the opportunity to mature into a major naval strike force. That is why it ranks here rather than at the absolute bottom. The aircraft was a genuine dive bomber with a coherent purpose, but its limited numbers and wartime circumstances prevented that concept from becoming a major success. The LN-401 was designed for precision warfare. France gave it a war of survival instead. Number 6. Volti Vengeance, United States. The Volti Vengeance is one of the strangest aircraft on this list because the aircraft itself was not simply a failure. Its problem was that the world it had been designed for was disappearing. The Vengeance was a dedicated dive bomber developed in the United States and employed by the RAF, and Indian units in the Burma and Southeast Asian theaters. The Australian War Memorial records its use by RAF squadrons and describes its employment against Japanese positions. Its narrow specialization was both its strength and its weakness. In the right environment, steep dive bombing gave ground forces a precise weapon. But the aircraft had limited range, and Australian operational experience showed that this became a serious problem in New Guinea. The Australian War Memorial specifically records the Vengeance's short range as making it unsuitable for operations there. The aircraft did conduct real combat missions. RAF records preserve photographs of Vengeance formations preparing for steep dive attacks, while RAF museum material notes that the type provided precision close support bombing in the Far East from 1942 into 1944. Number 7. Douglas A-24 Banshee, United States. The A-24 Banshee began life with an enormous advantage. It was essentially the Army version of the proven Douglas SBD Dauntless. The U.S. Army Air Corps became interested in dive bombing after observing German successes in Poland and France. In 1941, it ordered the Dauntless without the Navy's carrier tailhook and designated it A-24. On paper, this should have been a very capable solution. But the early Pacific deployment exposed a painful problem. An excellent aircraft could still become ineffective when placed in the wrong operational environment. When A-24s reached Java, only a small number were serviceable after accidents and maintenance problems. The unit operated without adequate fighter protection, and the aircraft lacked armor and self-sealing fuel tanks. The National Museum of the U.S. Air Force records that the unit suffered heavy losses and eventually evacuated. The situation became even worse in New Guinea. On July 26, 1942, 7 A-24s attacked a Japanese convoy. 5 were shot down, another was badly damaged, and only one survived intact. Remaining A-24s were eventually relegated largely to non-combat duties until later improved versions appeared. The A-24 therefore ranks below its naval sibling not because the basic airframe was inherently poor, but because the Army's early operational employment exposed its limitations. The Banshee inherited the Dauntless strengths, but not the Navy's entire operating environment. Number 8. Blackburn Skua, United Kingdom. The Blackburn Skua was an unusual aircraft because Britain expected it to perform 2 jobs, fleet defense and dive bombing. That flexibility looked attractive before the war. In practice, it created compromises. The Skua entered service as the Fleet Air Arm's first monoplane fighter, while also serving as a dive bomber. But by the time Britain was fighting a modern air war, the aircraft's performance was insufficient for sustained fighter combat against faster opponents. Its dive bombing capability was useful, but the aircraft's dual role meant it could not offer the fighter performance that a dedicated modern fighter could provide. The Skua did nevertheless achieve an important historical distinction. It was involved in the sinking of the German cruiser Königsberg in April 1940, demonstrating that the aircraft could deliver effective dive bombing attacks under combat conditions. But that success cannot change the larger problem. As a fighter, it was becoming obsolete, and as a dive bomber, it was increasingly overshadowed by aircraft designed specifically around the role. Its ranking reflects that contradiction. The Skua was neither a useless aircraft nor a complete failure. It was a useful transitional machine that entered a war in which speed and specialization were becoming increasingly important. The Skua could fight and bomb, but the coming war demanded aircraft that could excel at one job without compromise. Number 9. Fairey Barracuda, United Kingdom. The Fairey Barracuda deserves a higher position than many people would expect because its weaknesses were real, but so were its achievements. The Barracuda was a British carrier-based strike aircraft designed to replace older torpedo bombers and dive bombers. It was intended to carry bombs or torpedoes and attack targets from low-level or diving approaches. Its early career was difficult. The aircraft was large for a single-engine carrier aircraft and suffered from engine and performance issues, especially when the original power plant proved inadequate. The solution came through later engine improvements, but that process delayed the aircraft's full effectiveness. Once mature versions entered service, however, the Barracuda became a useful fleet strike aircraft. Its versatility allowed it to attack ships with bombs or torpedoes rather than being restricted to a single weapon. That versatility is why it rises above the more narrowly specialized failures. The Barracuda was not the fastest or most glamorous dive bomber of the war. It was instead a practical response to Britain's need for a modern carrier strike aircraft. Its story also illustrates why ranking dive bombers purely by speed would be misleading. An aircraft can be slower and still be more useful if it brings the right weapons, range, carrier compatibility, and operational flexibility. The Barracuda was never perfect, but unlike the failures below it, it eventually became a genuinely useful fleet weapon. Now moving the best dive bomber. Starting with number 1, Yokosuka D4 Wai Japan. The Yokosuka D4 Wai was Japan's attempt to build a faster generation of carrier dive bomber, and its design philosophy was radically different from the older Aichi D3A. Development began in 1938 as a replacement for the D3A. The aircraft was a streamlined, all-metal monoplane with retractable landing gear and a bomb bay. Its emphasis was speed and range. That ambition created serious problems. During testing, the aircraft experienced dangerous wing flutter in dives, and the structural problem had to be resolved before it could fully perform its intended dive bombing role. Early aircraft were therefore used as reconnaissance machines where they could exploit their speed without subjecting the structure to the same stresses. Eventually, the structural problems were corrected, and the D4Y became a capable dive bomber. Later versions using a radial engine improved operational reliability, although the change also brought performance compromises. The aircraft's biggest weakness was protection. The pursuit of speed and range came at the cost of armor and self-sealing fuel tanks, leaving it vulnerable when Allied fighter defenses became stronger. Approximately 2,038 D4YS of all variants were produced. That combination of speed, range, and useful payload earns the Suisei a place among the better dive bombers, but its vulnerability keeps it out of the elite group. The Suisei was fast enough to frighten an interceptor, but not protected enough to survive one reliably. Number 2. Henschel HS-123, Germany. The Henschel HS-123 belonged to an older generation, but its battlefield performance gave it a reputation that lasted far longer than its production run. It was a compact single-engine biplane designed specifically for dive bombing and close support. Unlike many later aircraft, the HS-123 was not expected to perform at fighter-like speeds. Its strength was ruggedness and its ability to deliver bombs accurately at low altitude. The aircraft saw combat during the Spanish Civil War before entering German service and became useful during the early campaigns of World War II. Its biplane configuration should have been obsolete quickly, yet the HS-123's rugged construction and low-altitude attack capability made it valuable to German ground forces. The aircraft could absorb punishment that made more delicate machines uncomfortable, and its direct control response suited the low-level battlefield environment. But it had an obvious ceiling: speed. Once Allied fighters became faster and ground defenses intensified, the HS-123 could not evolve into a modern fast-attack aircraft. Production ended long before the war was over, and its remaining aircraft eventually disappeared from frontline service. That limits its ranking. The HS-123 was not a technological masterpiece. It was something more practical, an aircraft whose design matched the battlefield of the late 1930s remarkably well. The HS-123 proved that an old design can remain dangerous when its mission fits its strengths. Number 3. Aichi D-3A VAL Japan. The Aichi D-3A VAL began the Pacific War as one of the most important carrier dive bombers in the world. It was already an older design by 1941, with fixed landing gear that created drag and limited its speed. Yet its design was remarkably well matched to Japanese carrier doctrine. The D-3A could perform steep, controlled dives using dedicated dive brakes, allowing its crews to attack ships with precision. It participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor and remained a major Japanese dive bomber during the early Pacific War. Its greatest weakness was longevity. As Allied fighters improved, the VAL's limited speed and lack of modern performance became increasingly serious. Its fixed landing gear was an aerodynamic disadvantage that could not easily be corrected without redesigning the aircraft. But ranking it too low would ignore what happened during the first years of the Pacific War. The D-3A was an effective weapon against Allied ships and remained useful long after newer aircraft were appearing. It was also responsible for a remarkable combat record during the early carrier battles. Its position at number 8 therefore reflects both sides of the story: an exceptionally useful early war dive bomber whose design eventually became too slow for the evolving air war. The VAL entered the Pacific War as a weapon of precision and left it as a symbol of a disappearing era. Number 4. Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver, United States. The Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver had one of the most difficult development stories of any successful World War II aircraft. The Navy ordered the prototype in 1939, but development was prolonged by technical and developmental problems. Even after entering service, the aircraft had a reputation for difficult handling and mechanical issues. The U.S. Navy records problems involving systems including the hydraulics and arresting gear. Yet the Helldiver eventually became the principal operational carrier dive bomber of the U.S. Navy. That fact matters enormously. The aircraft was larger and more capable than the SBD, with greater payload capacity and the ability to carry rockets as well as bombs. The Navy's official final wartime report described the Helldiver as capable of more than 250 miles per hour and carrying up to 2,000 pounds of bombs, along with rockets and heavier gun armament. The transition was not painless. Experienced pilots had to adapt to the aircraft's different diving characteristics. Lieutenant Commander James E. Vose, who had flown the SBD, explained that the Helldiver's higher diving speed required a different approach rather than simply pushing the aircraft straight over into a steep dive. Number 5. Fairey Barracuda, United Kingdom. The Barracuda rises further here because its greatest strength was not raw performance, it was versatility. Britain needed a carrier aircraft that could attack ships effectively while operating from increasingly demanding naval environments. The Barracuda eventually provided that capability as a strike aircraft able to carry bombs or torpedoes. Its development was complicated by engine problems and the aircraft's relatively large size, but later improvements turned it into a useful operational machine. The Barracuda became particularly important during British carrier operations against Japanese forces in the Indian Ocean and Pacific theaters. What separates it from the aircraft lower on this list is that it did not remain locked into one narrow tactical concept. It could adapt its weapons and mission to the target. That flexibility mattered because the naval battlefield was changing. Carrier aviation was no longer simply about one aircraft diving at one ship. Aircraft had to find targets, attack them with different weapons, operate from carriers, and survive increasingly strong air defenses. The Barracuda was not as famous as the Dauntless or Stuka, but its practical usefulness earns it this position. Its story is a reminder that a successful military aircraft does not always need to be the fastest or most elegant machine. The Barracuda earned its place not through glamour, but through versatility that survived the changing war. Number 6. Aichi B-7A Ryusei Japan. The Aichi B-7A Ryusei was one of Japan's most ambitious carrier attack aircraft and one of the clearest examples of Japanese naval aviation arriving at a powerful design just as the strategic situation was collapsing. The B-7A was conceived as a combined torpedo and dive bomber. It was fast, heavily armed, and capable of carrying either a torpedo or substantial bomb load. Its first prototype flew in 1942, but problems with its engine delayed production until 1944. By then, Japan had another problem. The carriers needed to operate it were disappearing. The aircraft was heavy enough that only Japan's larger modern carriers were suitable for it. The two carriers most closely associated with the type, Taiho and Shinano, were both lost. Only 114 B-7As were built. That tiny production total prevents it from ranking higher. An aircraft cannot become a truly dominant weapon if its fleet is collapsing before it can be deployed in meaningful numbers. But technically, the Ryusei was impressive. It combined dive bombing and torpedo capability with high speed and heavy armament. The tragedy of the B-7A is therefore not that the design failed, it is that the aircraft arrived too late. The Ryusei was one of Japan's best answers to the carrier war, and the carrier war was already ending. Number 7. Petlyakov Pe-2, Soviet Union. The Petlyakov Pe-2 was not a traditional single-engine naval dive bomber, but it became one of the Soviet Union's most important dive-bombing aircraft. Its origins were unusual. The design began from work on a high-speed aircraft concept before being transformed into a twin-engine dive bomber. That gave the Pe-2 something many specialized dive bombers lacked: speed and multi-role flexibility. More than 11,000 Pe-2s were produced, making it one of the most numerous twin-engine aircraft of the war. The aircraft carried a crew of 3 and normally carried around 600 kilograms of bombs, with greater loads possible depending on the configuration. Later versions received more powerful engines and improved defensive armament. The Pe-2 could attack from a dive, but it could also conduct reconnaissance, bombing, and other missions. That versatility was extremely valuable to the Red Army Air Force. Its early operational history was not effortless. Soviet aircraft units faced enormous losses and severe organizational difficulties during the German invasion. But the Pe-2 survived the early war crisis and developed into a major Soviet combat aircraft. Its ranking is based on that combination of production scale, speed, versatility, and sustained usefulness. The Pe-2 was more than a dive bomber. It was a Soviet workhorse built to keep fighting. Number 8. Junkers Ju-87 Stuka, Germany. Few aircraft are more closely associated with dive bombing than the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka. Its design was built around the dive bombing attack. Dive brakes allow the aircraft to control its descent, while its fixed landing gear and rugged structure reflected the tactical requirements of close air support. During Germany's early campaigns, the Stuka became one of the defining weapons of Blitzkrieg. It was particularly effective when German forces controlled the air and could use dive bombing against exposed ground targets, artillery positions, bridges, and other battlefield objectives. Its psychological reputation became almost as famous as its physical capability. But the Stuka's limitations were severe once the strategic environment changed. Its relatively low speed and specialized design made it vulnerable to modern fighters when it lacked adequate fighter protection. This is why the Stuka cannot simply be called the greatest dive bomber of the entire war. It was extraordinarily effective in the tactical conditions for which it had been designed, but increasingly vulnerable when Allied air superiority made those conditions disappear. The aircraft therefore earns third place because of its enormous influence and early war effectiveness, while its limitations prevent it from taking the top position. The Stuka mastered the battlefield it was built for and struggled when that battlefield disappeared. Number 9. Douglas SBD Dauntless, United States. The Douglas SBD Dauntless is where this ranking becomes genuinely difficult. The aircraft combine a relatively simple, rugged design with a highly effective dive bombing system. Its perforated split dive flaps stabilized the aircraft during steep dives and allowed pilots to attack at angles exceeding 70 degrees. That mattered enormously. The Dauntless was already in frontline service when the Pacific War began, serving with both the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps. It fought at Coral Sea, Midway, Guadalcanal, and across the Pacific. At Midway, Dauntless dive bombers attacked the Japanese carrier force at precisely the moment when the Japanese carriers were vulnerable. The U.S. Navy credits SBDs with sinking 4 Japanese carriers at Midway. The aircraft was not invulnerable. It was relatively slow compared with later fighters, and its crews faced intense anti-aircraft fire and fighter opposition. But its structural strength, dive bombing accuracy, and operational reliability made it remarkably effective. Even a combat report from the Coral Sea reveals the difficulty of the mission. U.S. Navy historian Sam Cox records that windscreens and bomb sights could fog during steep attacks, leaving pilots temporarily blinded during the dive. Yet the aircraft kept delivering results. The Dauntless was eventually replaced in carrier service by the SB-2C Helldiver, but that did not erase its wartime record. The Dauntless did not need to be the fastest aircraft in the sky. It needed to put the bomb where the enemy could not afford it. If you enjoy discovering the aircraft that shaped warfare, make sure to subscribe for more. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.